The stillness along California Street at dawn on April 18, 1906, lasted only seconds before the earth moved. In that interval, the James C. Flood Mansion stood complete. 3 stories of Connecticut brownstone, a bronze fence glinting in pre-dawn light, 42 rooms arranged behind Corinthian pilasters. It was the only genuine stone residence on San Francisco's Nob Hill, commissioned in 1885 by a Comstock silver baron who had turned mining speculation into urban permanence. Augustus Laver's architectural drawings promised a classical revival palace equal to any Eastern mansion. The deed, recorded at City Hall, transferred a full city block, bounded by California, Mason, Sacramento, and Cushman, into private hands for $1.5 million in construction costs alone. Yet within hours, fire would consume the interiors, leaving only the brownstone shell and its fence standing amid ruins. The house was built to outlast its owner. It would instead outlast its purpose. In the early 1880s, as Virginia City's Comstock lode began its long decline from peak production, James Clair Flood sat in his office at the Nevada Bank of San Francisco, far from the mines that had made him one of the wealthiest men in America. By the time he planned a house on San Francisco's Nob Hill, Flood was already known as one of the Bonanza Kings, senior partner in the consolidated Virginia and California mines, whose ore bodies had yielded more than $100 million in silver and gold between 1873 and 1882. The Comstock fortune had transformed 4 men, Flood, William O'Brien, John Mackay, and James Fair, from modest circumstances into figures of national prominence, their names appearing in newspapers from New York to London whenever mining stocks or Western wealth were discussed. From his offices at the Nevada Bank, which he controlled with O'Brien, Flood watched the conversion of mining profits into urban real estate, a process that defined San Francisco's growth in the 1870s and 1880s. The city's population had swelled to over 230,000 by 1880, making it the 10th largest in the United States and the undisputed commercial capital of the Pacific Coast. The decision to build at California and Mason Streets on the summit of Nob Hill placed his family among other palace builders, Leland Stanford, Charles Crocker, Mark Hopkins, on the city's most conspicuous ridge, a concentration of mansions literally overlooking the business district, the waterfront, and the bay beyond. The location was not accidental. Nob Hill had emerged in the 1870s as the preferred address for mining and railroad magnates, its steep slopes previously considered too difficult to build upon becoming desirable once cable car lines made the ascent practical. A travel writer passing along Nob Hill in the 1890s would later remark that James C. Flood's house is of brown stone, the only dwelling of that material in the state, its blocks imported from the East, at prodigious expense. The observation appeared in numerous guidebooks and travel accounts, always emphasizing the exceptional nature of the construction. Even before the house was finished, it existed in the public imagination as proof that Comstock silver had been successfully converted into stone, that Western fortunes could purchase Eastern materials and thereby claim equality with established wealth. The Gilded Age in the 1870s and 1880s layered speculative finance over raw extraction, creating a system where paper fortunes often exceeded the actual value of ore in the ground. On the Comstock, miners worked in extreme heat and poor air, in shafts that by the 1870s extended more than 3,000 feet below the surface. Temperature readings from deep workings regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, forcing mining companies to install elaborate ventilation systems and ice-cooled air circulation. Even with these improvements, shifts were limited to 4 hours because longer exposure led to heat prostration. Accidents were documented as inevitable, despite new safety devices. Cage failures, tunnel collapses, underground fires, and explosions of powder or gas killed dozens of workers annually. Contemporary engineering journals published detailed accounts of Comstock conditions, describing the physical toll on miners and the technological innovations required to extract ore from such hostile environments. On Nob Hill, separated by 200 miles and an economic transformation, the same money purchased silence, space, and views of the bay. The distance between the two landscapes was measured not in miles, but in the conversion rate of ore to capital, bullion to paper securities, paper to real estate. Financial historians examining the Bonanza firm's operations note that the partners controlled both production and speculation, owning mines while simultaneously manipulating the San Francisco stock exchanges where Comstock shares traded. They could profit from announcing rich ore discoveries that drove share prices up, then selling before the next inevitable decline when production figures disappointed investors. The Nevada Bank of San Francisco, which Flood managed, provided the capital infrastructure for this cycling, accepting deposits and making loans while also financing the partners' own stock operations. Flood himself had begun as a saloon keeper and stock trader, operating a tavern near the San Francisco Stock Exchange, where miners, speculators, and brokers gathered. His partnership with William O'Brien combined street-level intelligence about which stocks were moving with increasing capital to invest. Their alliance with John Mackay and James Fair, who brought mining expertise and technical knowledge, created a formidable combination. By the early 1870s, the four men had gained control of the richest sections of the Comstock lode, their consolidated Virginia and California mines producing ore so rich that for several years in the mid-1870s they dominated Western silver production. The brownstone mansion was not a refuge from the mines, but their translation into urban form, a single city block standing in for miles of underground tunnels, a visible monument replacing an invisible extraction. The first stones laid on California Street made visible what had been buried thousands of feet below Virginia City's streets. Records preserved at the San Francisco History Center show that Flood purchased the entire block bounded by California, Mason, Sacramento, and Cushman streets for approximately $90,000 in 1885, a sum that represented only a small fraction of his fortune, but a significant investment in San Francisco real estate. The site commanded views in three directions: north toward the Bay and the Golden Gate, east toward the Financial District and the waterfront, south toward the Mission District and the distant Peninsula Hills. The property's elevation, approximately 338 feet above sea level, placed it literally above the commercial city, a geographic position that mirrored social aspiration. Flood's decision to build in stone rather than wood reflected both practical and symbolic calculations. San Francisco's history of devastating fires, including major conflagrations in 1849, 1850, 1851, and smaller fires regularly through the 1860s and 1870s, made wood construction risky for valuable buildings. Insurance rates reflected this risk, with premiums for wooden structures significantly higher than for masonry buildings. Yet the symbolic dimension mattered equally. In eastern cities, brownstone signified establishment, respectability, and permanence. New York's wealthy neighborhoods, Murray Hill, the Upper East Side, were lined with brownstone townhouses and mansions. Philadelphia's Rittenhouse Square boasted similar construction. For a Western mining millionaire seeking to establish social credentials, building in genuine Eastern brownstone made a statement that no amount of painted wood could match. Next, architects and craftsmen would be asked to give that buried fortune a permanent shape, to translate abstract wealth into measured space, to create rooms and facades that would announce arrival while suggesting the fortune had always existed, had always been legitimate, had always been respectable. By 1884, Flood had engaged Augustus Laver, a Canadian-born architect who had established himself in San Francisco during the 1870s and early 1880s to design his Nob Hill house. Laver's background included training in classical architecture and experience with substantial commercial and residential projects in California. His drawings for the Flood residence, now preserved in architectural archives and echoed in the National Historic Landmark nomination prepared in the 1960s, show a three-part classical composition: a rusticated base suggesting strength and solidity, a tall piano nobile with arched windows providing the principal living spaces, and a heavy balustraded roofline crowning the composition. The facade followed established beaux-arts, principles taught in architectural schools and codified in pattern books. Symmetry as the foundation of all design, proportion derived from classical orders, and ornamental restraint that avoided excessive decoration while maintaining visual interest. The commission asked Laver to accomplish two goals simultaneously, goals that in some ways contradicted each other. First, to match the scale of neighboring palaces, the house had to occupy its entire block, bounded by California, Mason, Sacramento, and Cushman streets, and read as a single monumental mass from the street below and from other vantage points around the city. This required treating the building not as a house in the traditional sense, but as a palazzo, an urban villa that dominated its site and commanded attention. Second, to refine that mass into an expression of respectability, a word that appeared frequently in period descriptions of Comstock fortunes seeking social legitimacy in San Francisco's evolving class structure. While other Nob Hill mansions were constructed of wood frame covered with stucco painted to resemble stone, Flood insisted on genuine masonry construction using real brownstone imported from Connecticut. This decision would cost significantly more. Contemporary estimates suggested the stone alone added $200,000 to construction costs, but it would signal permanence, seriousness, and alignment with Eastern architectural standards. In Laver's drawings, now held in various California architectural collections and reproduced in preservation documentation, pilasters frame each window bay, their vertical lines emphasizing the building's height and creating a rhythm across the facade. Pediments sit above the upper-story window openings, providing shelter from rain while adding classical ornamentation. The central portico projects as a small temple front, its Corinthian columns supporting an entablature and sheltering the main entrance from both weather and casual observation. The overall composition follows a 5-bay arrangement, central entrance flanked by 2 windows on each side, replicated across the block's frontage to create a building that is symmetrical in detail but massive in scale. Laver's floor plans, preserved in building permit applications filed with the city and later documented in historic structure reports, called for 42 rooms spread across 2 main floors and a service basement. The spatial organization followed traditional Eastern mansion layouts, formal reception rooms facing California Street where visitors would enter, family living spaces toward the rear and sides where daily life could proceed with more privacy, and service areas in the basement where household staff would work largely invisible to the family and guests. The principal floor, what architects call the piano nobile, contained a grand entrance hall, formal parlor, drawing room, library, dining room, and conservatory. A grand staircase ascending from the entrance hall connected this public floor to the second story, where bedrooms, sitting rooms, dressing rooms, and private offices were arranged around a central corridor. The basement held kitchens, laundry facilities, storage rooms, wine cellars, servants' quarters, and the furnace room that would heat the entire structure. Light would enter through tall sash windows set in deep reveals cut through the thick brownstone walls, each window a vertical rectangle measuring approximately 8 feet high and 4 feet wide. The soundscape inside would be controlled by thick masonry walls. The brownstone-bearing walls measured 18 inches thick at the piano nobile level, and heavy doors that isolated each room from the next. Period architectural treatises emphasized that proper mansion design required acoustic separation, preventing sounds from kitchens or servants' areas from disturbing family spaces, and isolating reception rooms so that simultaneous events could occur without interference. The bronze fence encircling the entire block appears in early site plans as an ornamental boundary measuring approximately 60 feet in total length, 1 city block's perimeter in San Francisco's street grid. Specifications called for custom casting and installation at an estimated cost of $30,000, a sum that alone exceeded the total cost of an average San Francisco working-class house in the 1880s. The fence design, executed by craftsmen whose names are preserved in building contracts, incorporated musical motifs, lyres, notes, staffs, combined with elaborate scrollwork in a pattern that was visible and legible to passers-by but substantial enough to mark the property's perimeter clearly. The fence stood approximately 5 feet high, topped with decorative finials, and was anchored to a low stone curb that defined the property line. Contemporary observers noted that the fence, combined with the stone construction of the house itself, gave the property a finished Eastern appearance rare in Western cities where wood construction and rapid development were the norm. Laver's office produced detailed construction drawings showing wall thicknesses, foundation specifications, interior elevations, and ornamental details. These documents, referenced in preservation surveys and partially reproduced in architectural histories, indicate careful attention to both structural stability and symbolic presentation. The architect specified solid masonry-bearing walls throughout, rather than the timber framing common in San Francisco residential construction. Foundation work would extend deep into Nob Hill's rocky substrate, requiring excavation and possibly blasting to reach stable bearing material. The choice of load-bearing masonry construction reflected both engineering prudence, recognizing that San Francisco's history of urban fires made wood construction increasingly risky for major buildings, and symbolic intent. Stone suggested permanence in a city built mostly of lumber, a city that had burned repeatedly and might burn again. The drawings also reveal attention to modern mechanical systems. Plans called for gas lighting throughout, with fixtures in every major room and corridor. A central heating system using steam radiators would warm the house during San Francisco's damp winters, the furnace fired by coal delivered to the basement through a street-level chute. Indoor plumbing would serve multiple bathrooms, water closets, and service sinks, supplied by the city water system and heated by dedicated boilers. These systems, lighting, heating, plumbing, were standard in expensive Eastern mansions by the 1880s, but still marked luxury in San Francisco, where many houses relied on wood stoves, outdoor privies, and cold water. On paper, before any physical construction began, the house already resembled a fortress of manners, every molding calculated according to classical proportions, every column aligned to Vitruvian ratios, every room dimensioned to accommodate both furniture and social ritual. Before a single stone rose on Nob Hill, the architect had turned one man's speculative mining gains into an image of classical permanence, drawn in ink on vellum and ready for translation into 3 dimensions. The drawings represented not just a building, but a transformation. From the volatility of mining stocks to the stability of architecture, from the rough democracy of the mining camps to the hierarchical spaces of a palazzo, from Western improvisation to Eastern establishment. The next step was to make the drawings solid, to convert lines on paper into tons of carved stone shipped halfway around the world and assembled on a San Francisco hilltop. Construction began in earnest in 1885, when ships carrying pre-cut brownstone blocks departed Portland, Connecticut, embarked on the long maritime journey around Cape Horn, a voyage of approximately 15,000 miles taking several months, and arrived at the San Francisco wharves, where stevedores unloaded the numbered stones and transferred them to wagons for transport up California Street. Newspapers noted the novelty and expense. This was not local sandstone from Bay Area quarries, not faux stone created with stucco and paint, but real Eastern brownstone, each block cut to specific dimensions and numbered to correspond to Laver's architectural drawings. The Connecticut quarries that supplied the stone had been providing brownstone for New York's most prestigious buildings since the 1840s, their product recognized for its fine grain, warm color, and relative ease of carving. San Francisco, historically reliant on local materials, redwood timber from coastal forests, brick from Oakland clay beds, limestone from scattered California quarries, had never seen an import of building stone at this scale. The logistics of the operation were documented in shipping manifests, construction contracts, and newspaper accounts that emphasized the scope and cost. Each ship carried hundreds of tons of cut stone in its hold, the blocks carefully packed to prevent damage during the voyage's storms and rough seas. Upon arrival, the stones were inventoried, checked against architectural specifications, and transported to the Nob Hill site where masons began the assembly process. The construction site itself became a spectacle. Wagons hauling stone up the steep grade of California Street, steam-powered derricks lifting blocks into position, teams of skilled masons dressing and setting the stone with precision. Period photographs show the site surrounded by piles of brownstone blocks, lumber for scaffolding, barrels of lime for mortar, and the constant activity of dozens of workers. On Nob Hill, Teams of masons and laborers hoisted the blocks into place using steam-powered derricks and a complex system of ropes, pulleys, and temporary wooden frameworks. Contemporary descriptions emphasize both the technical challenge and the enormous expense. A block-square brownstone mansion, whose total cost would be reckoned at roughly $1.5 million, making it one of the most expensive private residences on the West Coast and comparable to the grandest mansions being built in eastern cities. The figure included not just the stone itself, but the specialized labor required to dress and set it, the foundation excavation in Nob Hill's rocky soil, the complex interior finishes that would follow the shell's completion, and the imported materials, marble, exotic woods, metals, that would create the interior spaces. The construction process unfolded in carefully sequenced stages, documented by building permits filed with the city, inspection reports preserved in municipal archives, and newspaper notices that tracked progress for a public fascinated by the scale of expenditure. First came excavation and foundation laying, which required blasting through the underlying rock to create a stable base and level platform. Engineers determined that the foundation would need to extend approximately 8 feet below grade, reaching bedrock that could support the weight of masonry walls 3 stories high. Foundation walls of concrete and stone were laid, creating a basement level that would house service spaces while providing a platform for the structure above. Then began the erection of the brownstone walls themselves, rising from the rusticated basement level, where the stone was left deliberately rough to suggest strength and create visual texture, through the tall piano noble windows that would admit light to the principal living spaces, to the balustraded cornice that crowned the composition and created a roofline visible from across the city. Scaffolding surrounded the entire block for more than a year, the wooden framework visible from downtown as a symbol of ongoing transformation on the hill. Contemporary accounts mention that workers could be seen from California Street, setting stones, pointing mortar joints, and carving ornamental details in place. Labor made. Periodic inspections, arriving by carriage to review progress, check alignment against his drawings, and approve change orders as the building rose, and practical considerations required minor modifications to the original design. The pace of construction was steady but not rushed, reflecting both the technical complexity of masonry work and the quality standards demanded by the client and architect. Masons worked with traditional tools, hammers, chisels, levels, plumb lines, that had changed little in centuries. Each stone had to be checked for proper fit, its bearing surface dressed to ensure even contact with the course below, its outer face aligned with its neighbors to create the continuous planes and curves of the facade. Mortar joints were pointed with care, the lime-based mortar mixed on site to proper consistency and applied in thin, uniform lines between stones. The work proceeded in horizontal courses, each level completed and allowed to set before the next began, the wall gradually rising as spring turned to summer, summer to fall, and the building envelope approached completion. Inside the rising walls, while masons continued their work on the upper stories, carpenters began framing interior floors and partitions. Timber beams spanning between the masonry-bearing walls supported floor systems of wooden joists and tongue-and-groove planking. Interior walls dividing rooms were built of wooden studs, lath, and plaster, a lighter, more flexible system than masonry that allowed for easier future modifications. By late 1885 or early 1886, the building was enclosed, its roof in place, its windows glazed, allowing interior finishing work to proceed protected from weather. For the interiors, Flood hired the New York firm Herder Brothers, perhaps the most prestigious decorating firm in America during the Gilded Age, which had opened a San Francisco office in the 1870s, to serve the Western mining and railroad magnates who were building mansions and seeking to furnish them with the same level of sophistication found in Eastern cities. The Herder Brothers specifications, preserved in business records now held in various archives and later summarized in preservation surveys and art historical studies, called for materials and craftsmanship that matched the exterior's ambition. Marble floors in the entrance hall and principal reception rooms, imported from Italian quarries and cut into geometric patterns. Carved wood paneling in the library and dining room, executed in mahogany and walnut by craftsmen trained in traditional woodworking. Gilded ceilings in the drawing room and ballroom, where skilled artisans applied thin sheets of gold leaf over prepared plaster surfaces. Imported textiles, silks from France, brocades from Italy, velvets from England, used for draperies, wall coverings, and upholstery. One room was specifically described in period accounts and later preservation documents as an East Indian interior, featuring teak carvings and embroideries acquired through designer Lockwood de Forest, who specialized in importing and adapting Indian decorative arts for wealthy American clients. The room exemplified the Gilded Age taste for exotic interiors, spaces that demonstrated both wealth, the ability to acquire rare objects from distant places, and cultural sophistication, the knowledge to arrange them tastefully. The firm's invoices, fragments of which survive in business records, document shipments of furniture, draperies, carpets, and lighting fixtures, each item selected to match the overall aesthetic of opulent restraint that characterized the best Gilded Age interiors. The main staircase became a focal point of the interior design, a piece of architecture that was also sculpture and symbol. Its marble treads, each a single piece of stone, cut, polished, and fitted with precision, ascended from the entrance hall to a landing, turned, and continued to the second-floor corridor. The balustrade featured elaborate metalwork, each baluster cast in bronze and finished to a high polish, supporting a mahogany handrail that curved smoothly at the turns. Period accounts mention that during large receptions, when hundreds of guests might circulate through the ground floor, velvet ropes would be drawn along the balustrade to guide traffic and protect the polished surfaces from damage. The staircase served both functional and symbolic purposes. It connected floors, obviously, but it also provided a stage for display, a setting where family members could descend to greet guests, where wedding parties might pose for photographs, where the architecture itself became a backdrop for social performance. Gas lighting throughout the house was supplemented by natural light from multiple sources. Tall windows admitted direct sunlight into rooms facing California Street and the other facades. Skylights in the upper hallways, constructed of iron frames and frosted glass, provided natural illumination during daytime hours while maintaining privacy from neighboring buildings in the street below. The combination allowed the house to be bright during the day without excessive exposure, maintaining the balance between illumination and privacy that mansion design required. 3 sensory anchors defined the finished structure and would remain characteristic through all the building's subsequent phases. First, the cool touch of brownstone on the facade, its surface slightly rough under fingertips, retaining the texture of Connecticut quarries and the grain of the stone itself, unchanged by the journey and the assembly. Second, the gleam of the 30,000 bronze fence catching afternoon light and reflecting it in complex patterns across the sidewalk, the metal surface polished to mirror brightness by workmen and maintained by household staff. Third, the muffled echo of carriage wheels on the stone-paved courtyard as they passed through the gate and approached the entrance, a sound absorbed by thick masonry walls but still audible in the ground floor rooms, announcing arrivals without broadcasting them to the neighborhood. The house was designed to be both seen and heard in specific controlled ways. From the street, its appearance commanded attention through mass material and classical proportions. Inside, its soundscape was carefully managed. Thick walls and heavy doors, isolated spaces, carpets and draperies absorbed noise, and the overall effect was one of quiet despite the building's size and the activities within. Every material choice, every spatial decision contributed to an atmosphere that suggested both grandeur and restraint, power exercised through understatement rather than ostentation. Every stone and chandelier carried the weight of ore lifted from underground, of silver extracted from deep veins beneath Virginia City's streets. The house rose as a kind of inverted mine, wealth extracted from darkness turned into light on polished marble, underground labor transformed into above-ground display, invisible and dangerous work manifesting as visible and comfortable domestic space. The architectural process itself mirrored in some ways the mining operation that funded it. Both required coordinated teams of specialized workers, precise engineering calculations, tolerance for significant financial risk, and faith that the investment would yield returns, whether in ore or in social position. Soon, the house would have to prove itself not just as architecture, but as a stage for social ascent, a setting where Comstock fortunes could be laundered through the alchemy of hospitality into something approaching respectability, where mining speculators could become pillars of society through the simple fact of owning a stone palace on California Street. When the Flood family moved into the completed mansion in 1886, taking possession of rooms whose walls still smelled of fresh plaster and new wood, the city around them continued its rapid transformation. San Francisco by the mid-1880s was no longer the rough frontier town of the gold rush era, no longer even the volatile commercial port of the immediate post-Civil War period, but an established city with mature institutions, settled neighborhoods, and an increasingly complex class structure. James Clair Flood, approaching his early 60s, had only a few years remaining to occupy what one historian would later term his great mansion atop Nob Hill. The house represented not retirement, Flood remained active in banking and investments, but consolidation, a physical statement that the volatile gains of the 1870s Comstock boom had been successfully converted into permanent form, that speculative fortune had become established wealth. Accounts from visitors who attended receptions and dinners at the house described the experience of entering under the classical portico, ascending a short flight of stone steps from the sidewalk level, and passing through heavy doors, bronze and glass, weighing hundreds of pounds, yet perfectly balanced on their hinges to swing open smoothly, into a grand reception hall. Light fell from high windows and from the skylight above the stairwell onto marble staircases held in place by elaborate metal balustrades. Period descriptions mention red velvet ropes that would be drawn along the handrail during crowded events, guiding guests and protecting the polished mahogany and bronze from the wear of hundreds of hands. Floors of inlaid wood and marble, geometric patterns created by different colored stones and different species of wood, carried the sound of footsteps into a high ceiling where elaborate plasterwork, gilded in places to catch and reflect light, created visual interest overhead. Crystal chandeliers, each weighing hundreds of pounds and holding dozens of gas jets, refracted artificial light into thousands of points that animated the space after dark. The effect was calculated through careful design and expensive materials. Every element contributed to an atmosphere of established wealth, of fortunes so secure they need not announce themselves through excessive ornament or obvious display. The gilding was restrained, applied only to highlight architectural details. The marble was fine but not garish, its colors subtle. The furnishings selected by Herter Brothers combined comfort with formality. Chairs that invited sitting but maintained upright posture, tables that served functions while displaying craftsmanship, carpets that insulated against cold and sound while exhibiting complex patterns. Contemporary books on etiquette and domestic design praised exactly this balance. Magnificence that appeared effortless, luxury that seemed natural rather than purchased. An 1890s travelogue, part of a series guiding tourists through San Francisco's notable sites, contrasted the huge wooden palaces of other mining and railroad magnates with Flood's exceptional stone house. The writer emphasized that all of the stone had been imported from the East at vast expense, marking the house as something fundamentally different from its neighbors. While the Hopkins Mansion, the Stanford House, and the Crocker residence were impressive, large, elaborately ornamented, visible from great distances, they remained recognizably Western in their materials and construction methods. Timber frames sheathed in painted wood, even when the paint imitated stone, could not fully escape their origins. The Flood House, by contrast, could have stood on Fifth Avenue in New York or Commonwealth Avenue in Boston without seeming out of place. It belonged to an architectural tradition that transcended regional identity, that claimed membership in a national and even international elite defined partly through building materials and design sophistication. The interior layout supported both family life and formal entertaining, with clear spatial hierarchies that managed access and maintained appropriate social distances. Reception rooms on the first floor opened to one another through wide doorways, a spatial arrangement called an enfilade that allowed circulation during large gatherings. Guests could move from entrance hall to drawing room to dining room to conservatory in a continuous flow, with sightlines extending through multiple spaces and creating a sense of expansiveness. The drawing room could accommodate dozens of guests standing and conversing. The dining room could seat 24 at a single table or be arranged for smaller, more intimate dinners. Newspapers' accounts of charity dinners and society events sometimes mentioned guest counts in the hundreds, though this likely included circulation through multiple rooms rather than all seated simultaneously. Family quarters occupied the second floor, where bedrooms, sitting rooms, dressing rooms, and private offices were arranged around a central hallway. This spatial separation between public entertaining spaces and private family life was standard in mansion design, reflecting both practical considerations, allowing the family privacy even when the house was filled with guests, and social conventions about the proper boundaries between public and private life. Servants accessed the family floor via backstairs from the service basement, allowing them to deliver breakfast trays, maintain fires, change linens, and perform other domestic tasks without using the grand staircase or encountering guests. Service spaces filled the basement, kitchens with coal-fired ranges and work tables where cooks and kitchen maids prepared meals for both family and guests, laundry facilities with wash tubs, mangles, and drying racks where household linens were cleaned weekly, storage rooms for coal, for wines and preserved foods, for household supplies, servants' quarters where some household staff slept, though many lived elsewhere and commuted daily, and the furnace room where fires were maintained to heat water and generate steam for the heating system. This service infrastructure, largely invisible to visitors and designed to be unheard and unnoticed, was essential to the house's functioning. A staff of perhaps a dozen or more, butler, housekeeper, cook, kitchen maids, chambermaids, laundresses, coachmen, gardeners, maintained the property and made possible the family's social life. In these same years, even as the Flood family settled into their California street mansion, Comstock share prices were falling on the San Francisco exchange, and the consolidated Virginia and California mines could no longer be worked at a profit. Ore grades declined measurably as mining pushed deeper, the richest veins exhausted. Water infiltration made extraction increasingly expensive, requiring constant pumping to prevent flooding. Speculative bubbles that had driven earlier stock prices, periods when shares traded at multiples of any reasonable assessment of actual mine value, collapsed as investors, finally recognizing the finite nature of even the richest silver lodes, refused to buy at inflated prices. By 1886, the Comstock was entering what historians call its twilight phase, continuing to produce ore but no longer generating the enormous profits of the mid-1870s. Historians examining the Bonanza firm's financial records note that the partners had caught them coming and going, a phrase acknowledging the sophisticated manipulation that characterized their operations. They profited from stock sales to speculators during booms, selling shares at peak prices while retaining enough holdings to maintain control. They profited from actual ore extraction when grades were high. And they controlled the infrastructure, mills, reduction works, water companies, timber suppliers, that serviced the mines, ensuring profits even when ore values declined. Most critically, they had already moved substantial wealth into more stable urban investments, banking, office buildings, commercial real estate, bonds, before the Comstock's decline became irreversible. Later investors who had purchased shares at inflated prices expecting continued growth found themselves holding near-worthless paper, while the original Bonanza Kings enjoyed steady income from diversified portfolios. The polished interiors of the California street mansion, recorded in photographs taken by society photographers and documented in preservation reports compiled decades later, belonged to a narrow window of time when silver wealth still felt bottomless to observers, when the mines seemed capable of producing indefinitely. Visitors in the late 1880s saw a house at the peak of its function, every room occupied and maintained, every surface gleaming under the attention of household staff who polished wood daily and washed windows weekly, every mechanical system functioning as designed. In the echo of the marble hall, where footsteps rang against stone and wood, one could already hear, though perhaps only in retrospect, the brevity of that illusion. The house was finished. Its owner's era was not. Within 3 years, Flood would be dead, and the question of the house's future would fall to heirs who had not commissioned it, who had not chosen its materials or arranged its rooms, who might not share the same attachment to California Street, and who would face decisions about maintaining, selling, or transforming the property. By the late 1880s, as San Francisco's population approached 300,000 and the city consolidated its position as the financial and cultural capital of the Pacific Coast, visitors ascending Nob Hill by cable car, the system had opened in the 1870s, making the steep slopes suddenly accessible, saw a continuous procession of palaces. The Chamber of Commerce Handbook, published annually to promote the city to investors and tourists, described a ridge where Comstock millionaires and railroad builders erected their mansions: Mark Hopkins, Leland Stanford, Charles Crocker, James C. Flood, noting that together, these houses cost millions of dollars and represented the largest concentration of private wealth in the American West. The ridge became a required destination for tourists and a source of civic pride for residents who rode cable cars up California Street specifically to view the architectural display, to see physical proof of San Francisco's success and sophistication. Flood's brownstone differentiated itself immediately from the neighboring wooden mansions, whose stuccoed facades only imitated stone through careful painting and scoring to create the appearance of masonry joints. Travel writers, whose accounts circulated nationally in magazines and guidebooks, lingered on the material contrast. The solid Eastern-looking house with its genuine brownstone and bronze fence, and the more exuberant, heavily ornamented wooden structures flanking it. The Hopkins Mansion, designed by the architectural firm of Wright and Sanders and completed in the early 1880s, featured elaborate Victorian carpentry, towers, turrets, decorative brackets, and painted surfaces in multiple colors. The Stanford House sprawled across its double lot with verandas, conservatories, and an eclectic combination of stylistic references. Both were impressive, commanding attention through their size and decorative elaboration, but both were also recognizably temporary in their materials, built of timber that could be modified, expanded, or replaced as tastes changed. Within this landscape of competitive display, where each mansion seemed to challenge its neighbors in scale and ornamentation, the Flood residence functioned as a statement not just of wealth, but of its character and permanence. For James Clare Flood, a one-time saloon keeper who had become one of the richest men in America, the house announced a rival not merely in fortune, but in respectability, a word that carried specific social meaning in Gilded Age America. Respectability implied that wealth had been legitimately earned, or at least legitimately held, that the family possessed not just money, but also the manners, education, and social connections that marked membership in elite society. Society columns in San Francisco newspapers, the Chronicle, the Examiner, the Call, recorded dinners, receptions, and charity events hosted by the Flood family, always mentioning the palatial residence on California Street as the backdrop. Guest lists preserved in social registers and in private correspondence included railroad executives, mining investors, judges, bankers, established merchant families, and visiting dignitaries from the East and from abroad, the mix suggesting that the Flood family had achieved, through wealth and through the strategic deployment of hospitality, integration into San Francisco's upper class. The social function of the house operated through carefully managed access, a system of invitations and protocols that controlled who entered and when. Not everyone who climbed Nob Hill to view. The mansions could enter the Flood house, invitations were required, and invitations signaled social standing. Charity events opened the doors to a broader public. Women's organizations raising funds for hospitals or orphanages might hold receptions that admitted members and subscribers, but always under structured conditions. Receiving lines where guests were formally greeted, designated routes through the first-floor rooms that prevented wandering into family quarters, ushers and staff stationed to guide traffic and answer questions. The architecture itself supported this management. The central entrance hall functioned as a sorting space, with doors leading to various reception rooms that could be opened or closed depending on the scale and nature of the event. For a small dinner, only the dining room might be used. For a large reception, the drawing room, library, and conservatory would all be opened, creating a circuit through which guests could circulate. From the sidewalk, especially in the evening when San Francisco's fog rolled over Nob Hill and softened the streetlights, passers-by saw lamps glowing behind tall windows and heard only a faint murmur of voices, occasional music from a piano or small ensemble, the discreet sounds of prosperity and leisure. The bronze fence, polished to high gloss and maintained regularly by groundskeepers, reflected carriage lamps as they passed, creating a repeating pattern of light and shadow, a visual motif of intertwined metal that separated the hill from the commercial city below. The fence became, in contemporary descriptions and in later historical accounts, a symbol in itself, frequently mentioned in guidebooks, occasionally photographed separately as an example of fine decorative metalwork, and always cited with its cost, $30,000. That figure, equivalent to decades of a skilled worker's wages or the total cost of several modest houses, was repeated often enough to suggest that contemporaries understood the fence as a deliberate statement of expenditure, a demonstration that the fortune behind it was so vast that even boundaries could be luxurious. The mansion's place in the Nob Hill landscape was thus defined by both similarity and difference, both belonging and distinction. It shared the ridge with other great houses, participating in the same social circuits, hosting similar events, serving overlapping guest lists. Yet its materials set it fundamentally apart from its neighbors, signaling a different order of ambition and a different relationship to time. Where wood and paint could be refreshed or replaced every few years as fashions changed or as weather took its toll, stone suggested finality, a building not subject to the usual cycles of maintenance and modification. Where stucco imitated permanence, brownstone was permanent, or as permanent as any human construction could be. The house did not need to verbally announce its cost or its patron's wealth. The material itself carried that message to anyone with eyes to see and knowledge to interpret what they saw. Architectural critics and cultural observers, writing in newspapers and magazines with increasing sophistication as the Gilded Age progressed, noted these distinctions. An essay in a San Francisco arts journal compared the city's mansion architecture, praising the flood house's classical restraint and genuine materials, while noting that some neighbors' houses displayed exuberance bordering on vulgarity. The judgment reflected evolving taste. By the late 1880s and early 1890s, architectural fashion was moving away from Victorian eclecticism toward Beaux-Arts classicism, favoring symmetry and historical precedent over individualistic invention. Flood's house, whether intentionally or accidentally, aligned with this emerging preference. Seen from below, from the cable car as it ascended California Street, from the sidewalks where pedestrians paused to look up, from the windows of offices and shops in the financial district, the Flood Mansion was one more fortress in a row of fortresses, each surrounded by walls or iron fences, each set back from the street behind landscaped grounds, each commanding views while blocking casual observation into its interior. Yet its genuine stone and costly bronze fence hinted at anxieties that lay beneath the confident facades, a need to make wealth not just visible but durable, not just impressive but permanent, not just declared but proven through investment in materials that would outlast their owner. The next chapters explore what lay behind that brownstone facade, in the family's private life, in the fortune's actual sources, and in the moral landscape of an age that celebrated wealth while remaining ambivalent about how it was made. In the summer of 1889, scarcely 3 years after his Nob Hill mansion was finished and occupied, James Clare Flood died in Heidelberg, Germany, far from San Francisco, concluding a months-long tour of Europe that had taken him through the great cities and fashionable watering places where wealthy Americans increasingly spent their summers. He was 64 years old, his health declining after years of the stress that accompanied managing vast financial interests and navigating the volatile world of mining speculation and urban real estate. His death notice, published in the Daily Alta California and other San Francisco newspapers, listed an estate whose value exceeded what most contemporaries could easily comprehend. The brownstone mansion on California Street, valued at perhaps $1.5 million including its furnishings, a spectacular country property at Menlo Park on the San Francisco Peninsula, an estate called Linden Towers that would become famous in its own right. Extensive real estate holdings in San Francisco, Oakland, and Southern California, mining interests in Nevada and other western states, stock portfolios including shares in banks, railroads, utility companies, and industrial concerns, and liquid assets held in various financial institutions. The inventory attached to probate proceedings, filed in San Francisco Superior Court and preserved in state archives, documented in precise legal language what a Comstock fortune looked like after 20 years of diversification and reinvestment. The total value was estimated at several $1 million. Accounts vary, some suggesting $5 million, others significantly more, the uncertainty reflecting both the private nature of much wealth and the difficulty of assessing rapidly changing values in mining shares and real estate. What was clear was that Flood had successfully accomplished what many mining millionaires failed to achieve, converting volatile mining profits into stable income-producing assets that would support his heirs for generations, regardless of Comstock production levels. His daughter Jenny Flood, his only surviving child after the death of a son in childhood, inherited the bulk of the estate, including both the California Street Mansion and Linden Towers. She had married James L. Claggett, a mining investor whose fortune was substantial, though smaller than the Flood holdings, and the couple divided their time between San Francisco society and the Peninsula estate, which offered more space, gardens, and distance from the city's increasingly industrial character. Archival descriptions of Linden Towers, written from the perspective of Menlo Park historians decades later and preserved in local history collections, describe James Clare Flood in his final years, sitting in his block-square brownstone mansion on Nob Hill, surrounded by its glittering 30,000 brass rail, dreaming of life among the peninsula elite where railroad barons and established merchant families maintained country seats surrounded by acres of landscaped grounds. The image is revealing, suggesting that Nob Hill, for Flood, may have been simultaneously a culmination and a limitation, a place from which he had arrived, but also a place from which he imagined moving beyond, to country estates where space itself rather than urban height would demonstrate wealth, where privacy could be measured in acres rather than in thick walls and bronze fences. The brownstone mansion, while imposing and expensive, occupied only one city block in an increasingly crowded neighborhood. Linden Towers, by contrast, sprawled across 600 acres, with room for stables, greenhouses, elaborate gardens, agricultural operations, and the kind of rural gentleman's life that represented, in some Gilded Age thinking, the ultimate expression of arrived wealth. The Comstock lode that had made the fortune possible was by 1889 clearly exhausted as a significant producer. Mines that had once employed thousands of workers now operated with skeleton crews, extracting lower-grade ore from ever deeper levels at costs that often exceeded the value of the silver and gold recovered. Production statistics published in mining journals and in state reports showed steady decline from the peak years of the mid-1870s. The Virginia city that Flood had known during the Comstock's heyday, a boomtown of 25,000 to 30,000 people with multiple newspapers, several stock exchanges, an opera house, dozens of saloons, and round-the-clock industrial activity, was entering a long decline that would eventually reduce it to a near ghost town. Population dropped as miners sought work elsewhere. Businesses closed, buildings were abandoned or demolished for salvageable materials, and the landscape around the mines showed the accumulated scars of 2 decades of industrial extraction. Environmental historians examining the Comstock's legacy note the transformation of the Virginia range landscape. Entire forests on the eastern slopes of the Sierra Nevada, around Lake Tahoe, and in tributary valleys had been cut to feed the underground timber requirements and the surface mills. The trees were floated down specially constructed flumes, milled into square-set timbers and boards, and lowered into the mines where they shored up tunnels in working faces. By the late 1880s, photographs show stripped hillsides, eroded gullies where vegetation had been removed, and piles of crushed rock leached by chemical processing and left in vast tailings dumps around Virginia City. The immediate surroundings of the mines resembled a lunar landscape, denuded slopes, exposed geology, and an almost complete absence of organic life. Later, ecological studies would document contamination of water sources and soil, the chemical legacy of decades of ore processing. Meanwhile, on Nob Hill, the brownstone mansion continued to anchor the family's social presence in San Francisco, its address, 1000 California Street, functioning as a form of social capital. Invitations preserved in private manuscript collections held by the California Historical Society and other repositories mention receptions, dinners, and charity events at the residence of Mrs. James L. Claggett, Jenny Flood's married name. She maintained the property, continuing to employ household staff, and participated in the established pattern of formal entertaining that her father had initiated. Society pages in San Francisco newspapers recorded her presence at opera openings, at charity committee meetings, at museum dedications, always identified by her association with the California Street Mansion and, increasingly, with Linden Towers. Yet the house's meaning and function had already begun to shift in subtle ways. Built by James Clare Flood to announce his arrival at the pinnacle of San Francisco society and to secure his family's position among the city's elite, it was now the inheritance of a second generation that had not participated in the fortune's original creation, that had not worked the saloons or the stock exchanges, that had not experienced the volatility of mining speculation or the anxiety of watching ore grades decline. For Jenny Flood Claggett, born into wealth and raised in comfort, the house was neither a trophy of speculation nor a symbol of ascent, but simply a residence, one of several properties she owned, part of an established life rather than evidence of transformation. The architecture remained the same: the brownstone walls, the bronze fence, the marble staircases, the gilded ceilings. But its relationship to the fortune that built it had fundamentally changed, from active symbol of achievement to passive marker of inheritance, from statement of arrival to background assumption of continued privilege. James Clare. Flood's death underscored the central paradox that haunts all such architectural projects. Houses built to establish and perpetuate family position outlive their commissioners almost immediately, passing to heirs who relate to them differently, who did not choose their design or supervise their construction, and who may have different priorities or attachments. The brownstone mansion's survival as a family residence depended on heirs willing to maintain it, to pay the substantial annual costs of operation, taxes, insurance, staff wages, maintenance, utilities, and to value the property's social significance enough to justify those costs. For wealthy families with multiple properties and diverse investments, such decisions were never automatic. In Flood's will, carefully drafted by San Francisco attorneys and probated through months of legal proceedings, the mansion was both a valuable asset, its location and materials made it worth preserving, and a potentially burdensome one, a large urban house requiring constant attention in an era when the very wealthy were increasingly favoring country estates, urban apartments with professional management, or smaller, more convenient city houses. The question of the mansion's long-term future was deferred, not resolved, by Jenny Flood Claggett's decision to maintain it. She had the resources, certainly, and perhaps the social ambition or sense of family obligation to keep the property in working order. Yet larger forces than family preference or financial capacity would soon intervene, rendering all such personal decisions suddenly irrelevant, testing whether Connecticut brownstone could truly provide the permanence its patron had sought. While formal dinners were served by liveried staff in the gilded dining room of the California Street Mansion during the late 1880s, guests seated at a table that could accommodate 24 served multiple courses on imported china, attended by a butler and footman who moved through the room silently and efficiently. Newspapers in Nevada and California continued to report mining accidents on the Comstock with depressing regularity. The contrast was not merely spatial or economic, but moral, a gap between lived experiences so vast that it challenged the coherence of any single social narrative. Articles documented disasters like the 1869 Yellow Jacket fire, which had killed 45 miners trapped in a shaft filled with toxic smoke when timber supports ignited, setting off a chain reaction that turned underground workings into a furnace. Subsequent accidents, cage failures that dropped workers hundreds of feet down shafts, explosions of black powder or natural gas that killed groups of workers in single blasts, rockfalls and cave-ins despite elaborate timber support systems, appeared regularly in mining news columns, their cumulative effect creating a drumbeat of industrial mortality. Contemporary engineering reports from the Comstock, published in mining journals and preserved in technical libraries, document working conditions that made such accidents not merely possible but, in the carefully chosen language of engineers and mine operators, inevitable. Temperatures in the deepest workings, by the late 1870s, mines extended more than 3,000 feet below the surface, regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit and occasionally approached 140 degrees in some of the hottest drifts. Miners worked stripped to minimal clothing in air so humid and hot that breathing itself became difficult. Shifts were limited to 4 hours, and even then, heat prostration claimed workers regularly. Companies installed elaborate ventilation systems, fans driven by steam engines, air shafts extending from the surface to the deepest levels, ice houses where air was cooled before being pumped underground. But the volume and temperature differential were insufficient to fully mitigate conditions. Water infiltration, a constant problem in Comstock mines, required around-the-clock pumping using massive steam-powered pumps. Mechanical failures could flood entire levels in hours, drowning miners who could not reach ladders or cages in time. The timber sets that supported miles of underground tunnels, a system called square-set timbering that the Comstock mines pioneered and that became standard in deep hard rock mining, required continuous inspection, maintenance, and replacement. Even massive timbers, some measuring a foot square in cross-section, would eventually crush under the pressure of thousands of feet of overlying rock. Engineers could calculate probable failure rates and replacement schedules, but cave-ins still occurred when ground pressure exceeded predictions or when a piece of timber harbored an unseen defect. Miners developed a sixth sense for reading the sounds of working timbers, the creaks and groans that signaled stress. But this intuition could not eliminate risk, only sometimes provide warning enough to evacuate a section before collapse. The contrast between these documented realities and the polished surfaces of the Nob Hill mansion was not a moral metaphor but a documented simultaneity, two aspects of a single economic system operating in parallel. Miners descended hundreds of feet below Virginia City streets every morning, while the Flood family and their guests ascended the marble steps of the California Street mansion every evening for dinner. The same fortune paid for both, for the timber shoring up drifts 3,000 feet underground and for the teak carvings in the East Indian Room, for safety cages that sometimes failed due to cable wear or mechanical problems, and for crystal chandeliers that never failed because they were maintained weekly by household staff, for the pumps that kept working areas from flooding and for the fountains in the conservatory, for the ventilation fans that provided marginally cooler air in the stopes, and for the coal that heated water for the mansion's radiators and bathrooms. Financial records from the Bonanza firm, examined by historians and preserved in various archives, show the accounting structure that linked these elements. Ore extraction costs included labor, wages for miners, shift bosses, and engineers, equipment, cages, hoists, pumps, rails, ore cars, consumables, black powder for blasting, candles and later calcium lamps for lighting, timber for supports, and safety measures, ventilation systems, inspection protocols, rescue equipment. These costs were balanced against ore value, assayed daily and tracked carefully, and against the other revenue streams the partners controlled, milling fees charged to process ore from mines they didn't own, water sales to companies that relied on their water systems, timber sales from forests they had purchased, and crucially, stock market manipulation that allowed them to profit from share price movements regardless of actual ore grades. The system worked from the perspective of the Bonanza firm's partners because they controlled both production and speculation, both the physical mines and the paper markets where mine ownership was bought and sold. They could announce rich ore discoveries, sometimes real, sometimes exaggerated, that drove stock prices up, then sell shares to eager speculators at peak prices. They could consolidate ownership during market downturns, buying shares from disappointed investors at depressed prices. And they could time their disclosures and their trading to maximize profits while remaining on the legal side of fraud statutes, which in the 1870s and 1880s were weakly written and rarely enforced in mining contexts. Photographs taken in the 1880s and 1890s around Virginia City and the Comstock Mining District, preserved in collections at the Nevada Historical Society and the Library of Congress, show surface landscapes transformed by industrial extraction. Hillsides stripped of trees appear as barren slopes, their surfaces scarred by erosion gullies where vegetation no longer stabilized soil. Vast piles of crushed rock, tailings from ore processing, surround mill sites, the material leached with mercury and cyanide to extract precious metals, then dumped without concern for environmental impact. The Virginia Range, which had been forested with pine and juniper before the mining boom, became a study in industrial exhaustion, denuded, eroded, and contaminated. Environmental historians note that entire watersheds were affected, with heavy metals from ore processing entering streams and groundwater, contamination that would persist for more than a century. The forests around Lake Tahoe and in the eastern Sierra Nevada were systematically harvested to feed Comstock timber requirements. Contemporary accounts describe vast logging operations, trees felled by hand, cut to length, transported to flumes, V-shaped wooden channels filled with flowing water, and floated dozens of miles to sawmills near Virginia City, where they were milled into the timbers and planks that would be lowered into the mines. The scale was industrial, millions of board feet annually, sustained for 2 decades. By the 1880s, large areas around the Comstock had been cut over completely, the landscape transformed from forest to stumps and brush. Back on Nob Hill, far from these scenes of extraction and exhaustion, the bronze fence serves as our recurring motif and metaphor. It was both barrier and frame, both functional and symbolic, a physical structure of intertwined metal scrollwork that defined the property's perimeter and prevented casual entry, and a visual statement that separated the mansion's world from the commercial city below. On foggy evenings, common in San Francisco year-round, but especially during summer when marine air flowed through the Golden Gate, the fence caught streetlight and threw soft, diffused shadows onto the sidewalk. Its substance was solid bronze, expensive to cast and to install, requiring skilled metalworkers to fabricate the individual elements and to assemble them on site. Yet its message was entirely about separation, about marking a boundary that was simultaneously permeable to vision and impermeable to physical entry, allowing passers-by to see the mansion's facade while preventing them from approaching the doors. The fence cost as much as several miners would earn in their entire working lives, $30,000 in 1886, equivalent to perhaps 30 years of wages for a Comstock miner. Its decorative scrollwork represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor, designing the pattern, carving the master forms, casting the bronze elements, finishing the surfaces, and maintaining the polish. Yet, for those who polished it, for the groundskeepers employed to keep its surface gleaming, it was simply another task in the endless cycle of maintenance that large houses required. The irony was structural. The fortune that made the fence possible came from mines where workers died regularly. Yet the fence itself was maintained by workers whose labor was safe, dignified, and relatively well compensated by contemporary standards. The house on California Street therefore stands in historical retrospect, not only as an architectural object worthy of study for its design and construction, but as a moral document, a physical record of what Gilded Age society was willing to accept, what it chose to frame as inevitable or necessary, what transformations of wealth and materials it permitted without sustained ethical examination. In the space between the brownstone's cool facade and the heat of the deepest Comstock working faces, an entire economic and social system operated, converting human effort and environmental destruction into objects of beauty and symbols of status, translating danger and death into safety and comfort, transforming industrial violence into domestic tranquility. In the next act, geological and human forces will test the mansion's claims to permanence, will breach its walls and scatter its contents, will reveal that no amount of imported stone can truly defend against time, chance, and the Earth's power to unmake what humans have made. At 5:12 a.m. on April 18, 1906, the ground beneath San Francisco heaved in a series of shocks that lasted approximately 60 seconds, though survivors would later describe the duration as both eternal and instantaneous. Seismographs hundreds of miles away recorded a magnitude now estimated between 7.8 and 8.0, with the epicenter along the San Andreas Fault northwest of the city near the town of Olema. First-hand accounts from Nob Hill residents note that the initial shock threw sleepers from their beds, sent furniture sliding across floors, shattered windows along California Street, and toppled chimneys from the neighboring wooden mansions. The brownstone flood mansion, though violently shaken, objects fell from shelves, plaster cracked, some interior partitions shifted, remained structurally intact through the main shock and its aftershocks. The solid masonry walls, built with 18-inch thick brownstone and properly mortared joints, flexed slightly under the seismic waves, but did not crack catastrophically or collapse, unlike many of the city's unreinforced brick buildings which failed immediately. Within hours of the earthquake, fires began breaking out across San Francisco, fed by broken gas lines, overturned cooking stoves, fallen chimneys that scattered live coals, and in some cases by exposed electrical wiring from the city's recently installed power system. The city's water system, with its distribution mains crossing the San Andreas Fault and its reservoirs damaged by ground shaking, provided inadequate pressure for firefighting in most neighborhoods. Firemen reported opening hydrants to find only a trickle or no water at all. The flames, unchecked, spread rapidly through San Francisco's densely built neighborhoods where wooden construction predominated and where narrow streets allowed fire to jump easily from building to building. On Nob Hill, the fires approached from multiple directions during the day of April 18th and through the night into April 19th. Contemporary accounts describe residents watching the flames climb California Street from downtown, watching them spread from the western neighborhoods, realizing that the ring was tightening. The Hopkins Mansion, a massive wooden structure despite its name and reputation, caught fire during the afternoon of the 18th. By evening it was fully involved, the flames visible from across the city. The Stanford House followed within hours. Witnesses describe efforts to create fire breaks by demolishing buildings in the flames' path, but without adequate water pressure to wet down structures and with winds shifting unpredictably, these efforts failed to halt the fire's advance. The flood mansion burned differently from its neighbors, a difference captured in photographs taken in the days immediately following the disaster. The fire entered through the wooden roof. Slate or tile had not been used, perhaps for reasons of cost or availability, and through the tall windows once their glass shattered from heat. Flames consumed the wooden interior floors, the timber joists and planking that spanned between the masonry-bearing walls. They consumed all the Herter brothers' work, the carved mahogany and walnut paneling, the gilded plasterwork, the imported textiles and draperies, the furniture and carpets, the doors and their frames, the grand staircase's wooden handrail. They consumed the interior partition walls of wood lath and plaster. They burned everything combustible down to the basement level, where stored coal and other flammable materials fed the fire further. Yet the brownstone shell survived. Photographs taken by Edith Irvine and other photographers in late April 1906, now preserved in collections at the Library of Congress, the Bancroft Library, and the San Francisco History Center, show the flood mansion standing amid a field of ruins, its brownstone walls blackened by smoke, rising 3 stories with window openings now empty of glass and frames, the roofline clearly visible against the sky where the wooden roof structure had completely burned away. Nearby, the sites of the Hopkins, Stanford, and Crocker mansions show only foundations, scattered pieces of stone ornament, and twisted metal, their wooden superstructures completely consumed, leaving almost nothing above ground level. The Fairmont Hotel, then under construction on the hill's northern slope, stood as a gutted shell, its steel structural frame intact, but every interior surface burned. Engineers from the U.S. Army and from the city's building department who inspected Nob Hill in late April and May 1906 documented the flood mansion's condition in reports now preserved in municipal archives. They found the walls structurally sound, plumb and stable despite the earthquake and fire. The brownstone had been discolored by smoke, the warm brown turning to black or dark gray on surfaces exposed to the most intense heat. But the stone itself remained intact, neither cracked by thermal shock nor weakened in its load-bearing capacity. The foundation was undamaged, still properly supporting the walls above. The bronze fence remained standing, smoke-stained and with a beat. Some sections warped where heat was most intense, but fundamentally intact. Its decorative scrollwork still legible. A preservation summary written decades later would note that the flood mansion was the first brownstone west of the Mississippi, and also the only great Nob Hill mansion whose structure survived the 1906 earthquake and fire, saved just barely by its Connecticut brownstone walls. The phrasing captures both the exceptionalism of the construction and the narrowness of its survival. Another few hours of intense heat or flames finding their way into cracks in the masonry might have caused the walls to fail. As it stood in late April 1906, the mansion was simultaneously a ruin and a salvageable structure, its original function destroyed, but its architectural bones intact. On the sidewalk, passers-by in the weeks after the disaster could walk the perimeter of the bronze fence and look directly through the mansion, seeing through empty window openings to the ruins beyond, to the bay, to the sky. The spatial experience had inverted completely. Where the house had once been a fortress of controlled access, permitting only invited guests to enter and see its interior, now it was transparent. Anyone could see through it, the burned shell hiding nothing. The sensory landscape had transformed as well. Where once the mansion's thick walls had created artificial quiet in the midst of urban noise, now the ruin amplified sound, the empty shell acting as an acoustic chamber where wind, rain, and voices echoed strangely. Where once the interior had been carefully climate-controlled, heated in winter, kept cool by thick walls and drawn shades in summer, now it admitted all weather equally, its rooms becoming outdoor spaces open to fog, rain, and sun. The 1906 earthquake and fire exposed the literal and symbolic limits of architectural ambition and the particular vulnerabilities of different building materials. Flood's investment in genuine Eastern brownstone, in load-bearing masonry construction, in walls 18 inches thick, bought survival of the shell when wooden mansions of equal or greater cost burned completely. Yet the house as a functioning residence, as a place where people lived, entertained, and maintained social position, was as thoroughly destroyed as if it had been built entirely of wood. The fortune spent on imported stone, on bronze fencing, on classical proportions and careful design, had created a structure that could withstand earthquake and retain its shape through fire, but had not prevented the loss of everything that made the structure a home, the interiors where daily life unfolded, the objects that bore family memory, the spatial qualities that distinguished one room from another. The next question, faced by the flood heirs in the months following April 1906, was whether this surviving shell had sufficient value, architectural, financial, or sentimental, to justify the expense and effort of reconstruction, or whether it should be demolished, the brownstone sold as salvage, the lot cleared and sold to new buyers who might build something entirely different. The brownstone walls and bronze fence stood through that summer and fall as the city debated its own future, as property owners across San Francisco made similar calculations about damaged and destroyed buildings, and as larger questions about urban rebuilding, fire codes, and architectural regulation began to reshape how the city thought about construction and permanence. In the months following April 1906, as San Francisco's population struggled to return to normal life, many living in tent camps, others having left the city entirely, businesses operating from temporary structures. The physical landscape of Nob Hill resembled an archaeological site. Visitors walking California Street saw foundations exposed to view, metal fragments of destroyed machinery, and household fixtures scattered across lots, and here and there a surviving wall or chimney standing isolated amid rubble. Photographers, both professional and amateur, documented the devastation extensively. The ruined flood mansion appeared repeatedly in their images, sometimes photographed from California Street, showing the intact facade with its empty windows, sometimes from other angles, revealing the complete absence of roof and interior floors, occasionally in comparative images, showing before and after views that emphasize the transformation from palace to shell. The Flood family, specifically Jenny Flood Claggett, who had inherited the property from her father, faced decisions shared by thousands of San Francisco property owners, but complicated by the mansion's exceptional character and cost. Insurance claims, probate records, and correspondence preserved in various archives document the family's assessment process. The building was insured, though the policy's earthquake exclusions and the unclear boundary between earthquake damage and fire damage led to months of negotiation with insurance companies. Initial estimates suggested that complete reconstruction, restoring the mansion as a family residence to its pre-earthquake condition, would cost perhaps $800,000 to $1 million, a sum comparable to a large fraction of the original construction cost. This expense, combined with the family's preference for their peninsula estate at Linden Towers, and perhaps also the psychological difficulty of living in a reconstructed version of a destroyed house, led to a decision not to restore the mansion as a residence. The gutted shell remained standing at 1000 California Street through 1906, 1907, and 1908. The windows were boarded with rough lumber to prevent trespassing and to provide some weather protection for the interior masonry surfaces. The bronze fence remained in place, now serving primarily to mark property boundaries and discourage scavengers from removing stone or metal. Rubble within the shell, collapsed interior walls, burned timber, masses of plaster, was gradually cleared by work crews, some hired by the Flood family, some working under city contracts to remove fire debris from streets and lots across the affected areas. By 1907, the interior was largely cleared to the basement level, leaving only the brownstone walls, the remnants of the grand staircase's masonry base, and the empty rectangular volumes where rooms had once been defined by floors and ceilings. Photographers continued to document the ruin, now producing images that circulated as commercial postcards and stereo views, commodifying the disaster for consumption by tourists and by people across America and abroad who were fascinated by San Francisco's destruction and rebuilding. These photographs served multiple functions: as historical record, as tourist souvenir, as moral lesson about urban vulnerability, and as advertisement for the city's resilience. The Flood mansion appeared in many such images, always identified by caption, often described as the only mansion to survive, or similar phrases that emphasized its exceptional status. The bronze fence featured prominently, its survival and its $30,000 cost mentioned frequently, the fence becoming a symbol of what money could and could not protect against catastrophe. By 1907 and 1908, as San Francisco's downtown was rapidly rebuilding, steel frame office buildings rising on Market Street, hotels reopening, commercial life resuming, inquiries arrived at the Flood family's attorney's offices from potential buyers interested in the California Street property. Some proposed converting the shell into apartments, dividing the vertical volume into multiple residential units that could be rented to the city's housing-short population. Others suggested building a hotel, capitalizing on the location and on the surviving masonry to reduce construction costs. A few inquiries came from individuals or groups interested in creating clubhouses or institutional buildings. Each proposal recognized that the surviving brownstone shell had value. It eliminated foundation and exterior wall costs for any new construction. It occupied a premier location on Nob Hill, and it carried historical associations that might be commercially or socially valuable. By 1909, the most serious inquiry came from the Pacific Union Club, a private social organization founded in 1889 through the merger of two earlier clubs, whose membership consisted of San Francisco's business and professional elite. The club had been operating from temporary quarters since the earthquake destroyed its previous building. Club records and building committee minutes, referenced in the San Francisco Landmark nomination prepared in the 1970s and in architectural histories, document extensive internal debate, Should the club purchase the flood ruin and adapt it, or should they seek an entirely new site where they could build according to their own specifications, without the constraints of an existing structure? Arguments in favor of purchasing the flood property emphasized several factors. The location was prestigious, Nob Hill having already re-established itself as a desirable address as rebuilding progressed. The surviving brownstone shell offered substantial cost savings. Estimates suggested that rebuilding within the existing walls would cost perhaps half what new construction would require, the foundation and exterior walls representing a significant portion of any building's expense. The structure's associations with pre-earthquake San Francisco, with the Bonanza Kings and the Gilded Age elite, might enhance the club's identity and continuity with the city's past. Some committee members argued that preserving the last surviving Nob Hill mansion was itself a worthy goal, that the club would be performing a service to San Francisco's historical memory. Arguments against the purchase focused on constraints. The existing walls would limit design freedom, requiring architects to work within predetermined spatial envelopes rather than creating optimal layouts from scratch. The structure's residential origins might not translate well to club functions, which require different room sizes and configurations than family living. The building's identity as the flood mansion might overshadow the club's own identity, visitors and members always seeing it as a converted house rather than as a purpose-built club. And there were practical concerns. Had the earthquake damaged the foundations or walls in ways that weren't immediately visible? Would the smoke-damaged brownstone require extensive cleaning or replacement? After months of deliberation, including engineering surveys that confirmed the structure's stability and cost estimates that confirmed the financial advantages, the Pacific Union Club negotiated to purchase the property. The sale was completed in 1909, transferring ownership from the flood heirs to the club. The transaction's terms, preserved in real estate records, included the lot, the ruined building, and the bronze fence, the entire property sold as a package. For the Flood family, the sale represented a reasonable resolution to a difficult situation, converting a damaged asset into liquid capital while knowing the property would be restored rather than demolished. For the Pacific Union Club, it represented an opportunity to acquire a prestigious property at below market cost while preserving a piece of San Francisco's architectural heritage. The moment when the purchase papers were signed and recorded marks a fundamental transformation in the building's history and meaning. The Flood Mansion ceased to be a family house, even in theory, and became an institutional property. The walls would remain, the general form would be preserved, but the interior spaces would be completely reimagined for different purposes, different users, different daily rhythms. Instead of bedrooms and parlors, arranged around family life, the reconstruction would create dining halls, meeting rooms, lounges, and recreational spaces arranged around club activities and male sociability. Instead of a household staff serving a single family, the building would employ a permanent professional staff serving a rotating membership. The architecture would be retained as form, as image, as historical reference, but hollowed out and refilled with different spatial organizations and social patterns. During the sale negotiations and early planning, the bronze fence remained a constant, still marking the same perimeter it had defined since 1886, now enclosing neither domestic life nor empty ruin, but anticipation, the space between what had been and what would be, built within the surviving walls. For passers-by on California Street, the fence framed a view that changed week by week as planning progressed and as the club hired architects and began design work. The shell, which had been simply a ruin for 3 years, became a promise, a construction project, a building to be that would honor the past while serving the present. Chapter 9, 1521 words. The Pacific Union Club hired Willis Polk, one of San Francisco's most prominent architects in the post-earthquake rebuilding period, to redesign the mansion's interior and adapt the structure for club use. Polk, born in Kentucky and trained in Chicago where he worked in Daniel Burnham's office, had established himself in San Francisco during the 1890s and early 1900s as an architect capable of sophisticated design in multiple styles, from Beaux-Arts classicism to Chicago school commercial architecture. His work on the flood reconstruction, documented in architectural drawings now held in the Environmental Design Archives at UC Berkeley and other California repositories, shows a comprehensive rethinking of the interior while carefully preserving the exterior appearance. Polk's design strategy, evident in the surviving drawings and construction documents, accepted the brownstone shell as a given, a frame within which he would work rather than a constraint to resent. The three-story height, the window locations and sizes, the overall floor area, the structural grid of bearing walls, all these were fixed by the existing structure. Within these parameters, Polk proposed adding a third full floor where Laver's original design had provided only attic space, expanding the building's usable area significantly. This required new floor framing within the existing walls, steel beams spanning between masonry-bearing walls to support the additional level, and careful attention to how the added weight would be distributed to the foundations. Engineering calculations, preserved in the construction documents, showed that the existing foundations could support the increased load without modification, a testament to the over-engineering common in 19th-century masonry construction. The floor plans show a complete reimagining of interior space. Where Laver had designed rooms for family life, parlor, library, dining room, bedrooms, dressing rooms, Polk created spaces for institutional functions. The first floor became primarily public, with a grand dining room occupying much of the California street frontage, a space that could seat perhaps 150 members at tables arranged across a room that extended through what had been multiple separate reception rooms in the original design. A billiard room, lounges for reading and conversation, and a coat room occupied other first-floor areas. The second floor held additional dining spaces, meeting rooms, and offices for club administration. The newly created third floor provided more meeting rooms and private dining areas for smaller groups. The basement, which in Laver's design had been service space, was substantially expanded and modified for recreation. Polk's plans show a swimming pool, a luxury amenity that few private clubs could afford, but that the Pacific Union Club deemed essential to its vision of providing comprehensive facilities for members. Athletic spaces, locker rooms, and equipment storage filled the basement level. Modern mechanical systems, heating, ventilation, plumbing, electrical, were installed throughout, replacing or supplementing what had existed before the fire. The club's requirements demanded far more infrastructure than a family residence. Commercial kitchens to prepare meals for dozens or hundreds daily, extensive plumbing for bathrooms in the swimming pool, robust heating for the larger volumes and longer daily operating hours, and emerging technologies like electric lighting and telephone systems. Polk retained the central entrance hall and the grand staircase, though he modified both to suit club circulation patterns. The staircase, whose marble treads and bronze balustrade had survived the fire, was restored and extended to serve the new third floor. The entrance hall became the club's primary circulation space, a place where members would enter, greet one another, consult the bulletin boards, and proceed to various parts of the building. Period descriptions of the completed space emphasize its combination of formality and comfort, marble floors echoing the original design, wood paneling on the walls suggesting warmth and tradition, adequate lighting from both windows and electrical fixtures, and furniture arranged to accommodate brief conversations without impeding circulation. Critically, for the building's long-term historical significance, Polk retained and restored the brownstone facade and the bronze fence. He ordered additional brownstone from the same Connecticut quarries that had supplied the original stone, using the new material to replace sections too damaged by fire to remain in place and to repair areas where earthquake cracks had developed. Masons cleaned the smoke-stained surfaces using techniques developed in post-fire restoration work across the city. Careful washing with water and mild detergents, gentle abrasion where staining was particularly deep, and repointing of mortar joints where the fire's heat had degraded the lime-based mortar. The fence was cleaned, straightened where it had warped, and its surface refinished to restore the bright bronze gleam that had characterized it before the disaster. The reconstruction work took several years. Photographs from 1911 and 1912 show the building surrounded by scaffolding, its roof partially complete, workers visible on upper floors through window openings. The bronze fence, serving now as a construction barrier, kept pedestrians at a safe distance while remaining a recognizable landmark. Construction proceeded through seasons and across labor strikes that affected San Francisco's building trades in the early 1910s. Contemporary newspaper accounts, tracking progress as they had tracked original construction in the 1880s, noted delays and milestones: roof nearly complete, interior finishes progressing, swimming pool being tiled. By late 1912, the work was essentially complete, and in early 1913, the Pacific Union Club formally opened its new clubhouse, hosting a dedication ceremony that acknowledged both the building's history and its transformation. The ceremony was covered in San Francisco newspapers, which described the handsome new clubhouse occupying the former flood mansion, always noting that the exterior walls of brownstone have been carefully preserved while the interior has been entirely reconstructed for club purposes. Invited guests, members, city officials, prominent businessmen, and representatives of other social clubs toured the building, viewing the dining room, the billiard room, the swimming pool, and other facilities. The event represented both an ending and a beginning, the final closure of the 1906 disaster's immediate aftermath for this particular building, and the start of a new phase of use that would continue for decades. In Polk's reconstruction, the building became what preservation scholars would later call an architectural palimpsest, a structure bearing visible traces of multiple historical layers. The brownstone walls and bronze fence carried forward from the 1880s, representing Flood's ambitions and Laver's design. The interior spaces, though entirely new, referenced club architecture of the early 20th century, with its emphasis on masculine sociability, athletic recreation, and professional networking. The building's identity became dual. Simultaneously, the Flood Mansion in historical memory and public nomenclature, and the Pacific Union Club in current function and legal title. This duality would persist, creating interesting tensions and rich historical meanings that visitors and scholars would interpret and reinterpret across the century to come. The strategy Polk employed, preserving the exterior while completely redesigning the interior, was not unique to this project, but represented broader, early 20th century attitudes toward historic buildings. In an era before formal preservation laws, before organizations like the National Trust for Historic Preservation existed, before concepts like adaptive reuse had been codified, property owners and architects made pragmatic decisions based on cost, aesthetics, and functional requirements. Polk's approach preserved what was publicly visible and symbolically significant, the facade that defined the building's appearance from the street, while treating the interior as entirely flexible, available for complete reimagining to suit new purposes. This represents a particular moment in preservation history, between the 19th century's tendency to demolish and rebuild entirely and the late 20th century's more comprehensive approach to preserving both exterior and significant interior features. For the brownstone walls and bronze fence, the reconstruction represented survival through transformation. They remained standing not because of inherent architectural merit alone, though the design had merit, but because a new owner found them useful, found that keeping them cost less than starting over, found that their historical associations enhanced rather than diminished the new building's social value. Permanence, it turned out, depended not just on building with durable materials, but on maintaining economic and social relevance across changing circumstances, on being valuable enough to subsequent generations that they chose preservation over demolition. Through the 20th century, as San Francisco evolved from post-earthquake reconstruction through wars, depression, boom, and transformation into a modern metropolitan center, the Pacific Union Club remained one of the city's most exclusive and most private institutions. Membership procedures stayed opaque to outsiders, governed by confidential nomination and vetting processes that emphasized social connections, professional standing, and personal character as judged by existing members. The club's constitution and bylaws, preserved in its archives though rarely shared publicly, defined membership as selective and limited. There were waiting lists, membership caps, annual resignations that opened slots for new applications. Financial capacity was implicitly required given the initiation fees, annual dues, and expected participation in club dinners and events, but the club formally defined itself as a social rather than purely economic organization, emphasizing camaraderie and civic connection alongside exclusivity. For the men who became members, and membership remained restricted to men through most of the 20th century, a restriction that would become increasingly controversial as social norms changed. The former Flood Mansion functioned as a second home, workplace extension, and social hub. From the classical portico, members could look across California Street to Grace Cathedral, constructed in the 1920s through 1960s on the site of the Odiuba Crocker Mansion, and to the Fairmont Hotel, rebuilt and expanded through the century. Looking down the California street slope, they saw the financial district where many members maintained offices, the skyscrapers rising through decades creating an evolving skyline. The view itself became part of the club's value, a vantage point on the city, a position of overview, a physical height that mirrored social elevation. Inside, Polk's interiors wrapped club life in materials and atmospheres designed to suggest tradition, comfort, and masculine ease. Leather chairs arranged in conversational groupings or placed individually for reading invited members to sit. Wooden tables, some small for intimate meals, others large for committee meetings or formal dinners, filled dining rooms on multiple floors. Persian carpets, their patterns complex and their colors rich, covered floors throughout the public spaces, softening footsteps and absorbing sound. Oil paintings, many donated by members or purchased by the club, hung on paneled walls depicting landscapes, maritime scenes, portraits of club founders and notable past presidents. The building maintained a specific aesthetic that balanced opulence with restraint, always suggesting prosperity but avoiding ostentation, creating spaces that felt established rather than new. The daily and seasonal rhythms of the club, lunches served at midday for businessmen stepping away from nearby offices, dinners in the evening ranging from informal to formal, depending on the occasion, weekend brunches, committee meetings in dedicated rooms, special events for holidays or to honor retiring members, played out in spaces designed specifically to accommodate them. The grand dining room on the first floor, with its high ceiling and large windows admitting natural light during daytime meals, served as the primary gathering space. The billiard room provided recreation. The swimming pool in the basement offered exercise. Reading rooms and lounges accommodated those seeking quiet. The spatial organization, Polk's interpretation of club requirements overlaid on the building's original footprint, generally worked well, though occasional complaints appeared in committee minutes about acoustics, about temperature control, about the inefficiency of some service routes between kitchen and upper-floor dining spaces. Throughout the 20th century, the club employed a permanent staff to maintain the building and serve members. A club manager overseeing operations, chefs and kitchen staff preparing meals, dining room servers, housekeeping staff cleaning spaces and maintaining finishes, maintenance workers repairing mechanical systems and fixing inevitable problems, doormen and coat check attendants managing entry, groundskeepers tending the small gardens visible through the bronze fence. This staff, largely invisible to casual observers from the street but essential to daily operations, represented a continuity with the building's original function as a household, though now serving an institutional family of several hundred members rather than a biological family of a few individuals. Yet the building's exterior remained essentially unchanged from Willis Polk's 1913 completion, which had in turn preserved Augustus Laver's 1886 design. This continuity was formally recognized in 1966 when the Flood Mansion was designated a National Historic Landmark, one of fewer than 2,000 such sites nationwide recognized for exceptional historical significance. The landmark designation, administered by the National Park Service, cited multiple reasons. The building was the first brownstone building west of the Mississippi River, representing the westward expansion of Eastern architectural traditions. It was the only Nob Hill mansion to structurally survive the 1906 earthquake and fire, making it an irreplaceable piece of San Francisco's history. And it exemplified classical revival architecture adapted to a Western American context, showing how national stylistic trends were interpreted in regional practice. The designation process, documented in the landmark nomination form prepared by historians and architects, assembled evidence from construction records, period photographs, architectural drawings, newspaper accounts, and scholarly sources. This archival work created a paper record that paralleled and documented the physical building. Descriptions of materials, Connecticut brownstone, load-bearing masonry walls, bronze fence, measurements, building dimensions, room sizes, historical associations, James Clare flood, Comstock load, Pacific Union Club, and architectural significance, classical revival style, Augustus Laver architect, Willis Polk reconstruction. The nomination described the building in neutral technical language while also positioning it within larger narratives about Western settlement, Gilded Age wealth, disaster survival, and urban preservation. In 1974, the building received additional protection through designation as a San Francisco landmark under the city's preservation ordinance. This local designation complemented the federal National Historic Landmark status, adding a layer of municipal review for any proposed changes to the exterior. Together, these designations formalized what the Pacific Union Club had already been doing voluntarily: maintaining the brownstone facade, preserving the bronze fence, protecting the building's historic character while allowing necessary updates to interior mechanical and life safety systems. For visitors to Nob Hill, tourists following guidebook walking tours, architecture students studying San Francisco's built environment, residents enjoying the neighborhood's relative quiet and dramatic views, the mansion functioned primarily as an image and a historical marker. The building was not open to the public, club policy maintained privacy for members, and the National Historic Landmark designation carried no requirement for access. People could walk the sidewalk along the bronze fence, could photograph the brownstone facade from California Street, could pause at the corner and read the brass plaques marking landmark status, but could not enter, could not see Polk's interiors, could not experience the building's spaces except through imagination informed by historical descriptions. This restriction, while disappointing to architecture enthusiasts and frustrating to preservation advocates who believed historic buildings should be publicly accessible, reflected the building's private ownership and ongoing use. Unlike house museums, which are preserved as educational sites open to visitors, the Flood Pacific Union Club building remained a functioning club, its preservation secured not through conversion to museum status, but through continuous use that justified the costs of maintenance and adaptation. The tension between private use and public interest in historic buildings would become a recurring theme in American preservation, with the Flood Mansion representing one model: private stewardship that maintains architectural integrity while limiting access. Guidebooks and architectural histories compensated for this limited access by providing detailed descriptions, historical photographs, and contextual information. Books about San Francisco architecture invariably included the Flood Mansion, typically with a full-page photograph showing the California Street facade and the bronze fence, accompanied by text explaining the building's history, its survival of the earthquake and fire, and its transformation from residence to club. These published accounts, along with National Historic Landmark documentation, created a widely accessible archive of information about a building that remained physically inaccessible, demonstrating how architectural knowledge can circulate independently of architectural experience. By the 1960s and 1970s, when the National Historic Landmark designation and the San Francisco Landmark designation were being prepared and approved, a specific historical consciousness had emerged in American culture, one that valued physical connections to the past and worried that rapid post-World War II development was erasing too much too quickly. The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, which created the formal framework for identifying and protecting significant buildings and sites, emerged from concerns about urban renewal projects that demolished entire neighborhoods, about highway construction that cut through historic districts, about the replacement of architecturally significant buildings with generic modern structures. In this context, buildings like the Flood Mansion gained new cultural value not just as architecture, but as tangible links to specific historical moments and processes, in this case, to the Comstock Lode, to Gilded Age fortunes, to the 1906 disaster, and to San Francisco's long rebuilding and evolution. The landmark nomination process required assembling documentation from scattered archives, construction records from San Francisco City files, photographs from the Bancroft Library and Library of Congress, newspaper accounts from microfilm, architectural drawings from various collections, and scholarly interpretations from histories of San Francisco, of mining, of Gilded Age architecture. This documentation assembled a detailed picture of the building's evolution. From Laver's 1886 design, through Flood's occupancy, through the earthquake and fire, through Polk's reconstruction, through decades of club use. Each document type contributed different information, different perspectives. Building permits provided technical specifications and construction costs. Photographs showed how the building appeared in different eras, how the streetscape around it changed, how damage from the earthquake and fire manifested. Newspaper accounts revealed public perceptions, how contemporaries understood the building's significance, what meanings they attached to it. Architectural drawings documented design intentions, spatial organizations, material choices. Together, these documents created what might be called a paper architecture, a textual and photographic representation of the physical building that could be studied, analyzed, and disseminated to audiences who might never see the actual structure. This paper architecture, preserved in climate-controlled archives and reproduced in published histories, might in some sense outlast the physical building itself. If the brownstone were ever to be demolished, the documentary record would persist, allowing future generations to understand what had existed and what had been lost. Preservation, in this view, operates on multiple levels simultaneously, maintaining physical structures certainly, but also maintaining and making accessible documentary records that explain those structures' significance. The landmark designations also position the Flood Mansion within broader historical narratives about economic development, social structure, and urban change in the American West. The building became a case study for understanding how mining wealth transformed Western cities, how fortunes extracted from the earth were converted into urban-built environments, how architectural ambitions reflected and shaped social hierarchies. The Comstock Lode history, with its technological innovations, its environmental impacts, its labor conditions, its financial manipulations, was inseparable from the mansion's history. The silver that funded construction came from specific mines where specific workers labored under documented conditions. The fortune that paid for brownstone and bronze fence arose from a system that combined industrial extraction with speculative finance. By the 1960s and 1970s, historical scholarship was increasingly attentive to these connections, less willing to celebrate architectural monuments without examining the social and environmental costs of their creation. Photographic archives, both historical and contemporary, played a crucial role in how people understood and related to the building. The Edith Irvine photographs from April 1906, showing the building as a smoke-blackened shell amid ruins, circulated widely and became iconic images of the disaster. They appeared in books about the earthquake, in museum exhibitions, in documentary films, always identified and contextualized. These photographs made visible what had been a temporary condition, the building as ruin, and froze that moment for continuous contemplation. Later photographs, taken as the club's occupation continued through decades, showed the restored building, the cleaned brownstone, the maintained bronze fence, the building as it appeared to mid- and late 20th century observers. Comparing these images across time revealed both continuity, the facade remained recognizably the same, and change in everything surrounding the building, the streetscape, neighboring architecture, vegetation, automobiles replacing carriages, the city growing denser and taller around the hilltop. Contemporary photography, practiced by tourists, students, and professional architectural photographers, continued to add to this archive. Each generation documented the building according to its own aesthetic and technical preferences. Black and white documentary photography in the mid-20th century, emphasizing form and texture. Color photography, later capturing the brownstone's warm tones and the fence's patina. Digital photography, making images instantly reproducible and shareable. The building thus existed not just as a physical structure occupying a specific city block, but as thousands of images circulating through books, magazines, postcards, websites, and social media, each image offering a particular view, a specific moment, a single photographer's interpretation. These representations, photographs, drawings, written descriptions, historical analyses, created a kind of dispersed, distributed knowledge about the building that resided in libraries, archives, museums, and increasingly in digital databases. Someone in Boston or Berlin, without ever visiting San Francisco, could study the Flood Mansion in considerable detail, could understand its architecture, its history, its significance. This democratization of architectural knowledge, enabled by photography, by publishing, and by digital technology, meant that landmark buildings became part of a shared cultural inheritance accessible to anyone interested enough to seek them out, even if the physical buildings themselves remained privately controlled and inaccessible. The preservation designations also served legal functions, providing mechanisms to prevent or at least slow demolition or drastic alteration. While the Pacific Union Club showed no interest in demolishing its home, the building served its purposes well, and any new construction would cost far more than ongoing maintenance. The landmark protections ensured that if future owners or circumstances changed, if economic calculations shifted, if development pressures increased, the building could not be demolished without extensive public review, environmental assessment, and consideration of alternatives. These procedural protections, embedded in preservation law, represented a judgment that some buildings' historical and cultural value transcended property rights, that the public had legitimate interests in preserving structures that shaped urban character and embodied shared history. Architectural historians and preservation scholars studying the Flood Mansion noted its rarity as a surviving example of Gilded Age mansion architecture in the West. While Eastern cities retained many such houses, Newport's mansions, New York's Frick Collection, and other preserved townhouses, Philadelphia's Rittenhouse Square residences, the West had lost most of its comparable structures to earthquake, fire, demolition, or radical alteration. The Flood Mansion, because of its stone construction and its fortunate transformation to club use, provided an irreplaceable reference point for understanding what these buildings looked like, how they functioned, what values they embodied. Preservation, in this context, served scholarship, allowing historians and architects to study from physical evidence rather than relying solely on photographs and documents. Today, walking up California Street in San Francisco, where the cable car line still ascends from the financial district to Nob Hill, where tourists and commuters share the narrow sidewalks, and where the city's maritime fog still rolls through in summer afternoons, you encounter the James C. Flood Mansion at the crest where California meets Mason Street, exactly where it has stood since 1886. The address, 1000 California Street, appears in guidebooks both printed and digital, on architectural walking tour maps, on historic landmark databases maintained by the National Park Service, and on the brass plaques affixed to the bronze fence that announce the building's National Historic Landmark status and its significance in San Francisco history. On a typical foggy morning, especially during summer when marine layer flows through the Golden Gate and blankets the city until midday, the brownstone facade reads almost monochrome in the diffused light. Moisture from the fog darkens the Connecticut stone, the pale brown turning deeper and more uniform in color, the stone's texture becoming more visible as the mineral surface absorbs water. The classical portico, with its Corinthian columns supporting the pediment, recedes somewhat into shadow, its details softened by mist. Window glass reflects the overcast sky as muted gray. The overall effect is subdued, quiet, more melancholic than the bright and assertive appearance the building presents on clear days when direct sunlight highlights the carved details and when shadows sharpen every edge and molding. Through the bars of the bronze fence, no longer gleaming as it did when first installed and when maintained by household staff polishing it regularly, but now carrying a soft patina, the surface oxidized to darker browns and green grays that record more than a century of exposure to San Francisco's corrosive marine air. You can glimpse the small gardens and lawns that occupy the narrow strip between fence and building. These landscapes, maintained by groundskeepers employed by the club, provide a buffer zone, a transition space between the public sidewalk and the private interior, softening the building's monumentality with vegetation while maintaining the separation the fence originally intended. On the foggy mornings, drops of moisture cling to leaves and grass blades, the plants serving as visible registers of weather, making the atmospheric conditions tangible and close. The soundscape of contemporary Nob Hill differs completely from the 1880s or even from the mid-20th century. Electric buses accelerate up the California street grade, their motors whining under load, occasionally stopping at the corner to pick up or discharge passengers, their brakes hissing pneumatically. The cable car system, preserved as much for tourism as for transportation, rings its bell continuously, a sound so associated with San Francisco that it appears in countless films and television shows as it climbs the hill. Automobiles pass steadily, their engines and tires creating a constant low roar that only quiets late at night or early morning. Pedestrians talk on mobile phones, their conversations fragments overheard as they pass. The soundscape is urban, mechanical, contemporary, bearing almost no resemblance to the horse-drawn carriages, footsteps, and relative quiet of the gaslight era. Yet the building's mass, its proportions, its materials remain essentially unchanged from Augustus Laver's 1886 design. Standing at the corner of California and Mason, you could line up historical photographs from different eras, 1888 showing the newly completed mansion, 1906 showing the burned shell, 1915 showing the rebuilt club, 1950, 1980, 2000, 2024, and observe the same fundamental architectural lines, the rusticated base with its ground floor openings, the tall piano noble windows with their arched tops and pediments, the balustraded roofline defining the building's crown, the central portico projecting to frame the entrance. What changes across these images is everything around the building, the neighboring structures rising and being rebuilt, the street furniture and plantings, the vehicles, the sky, and most subtly, the patinas and surface conditions that accumulate on the brownstone itself, the fence, recording time's passage. The history of the Comstock lode, with its environmental costs documented by scholars, its hazardous labor conditions recorded in contemporary accounts, and in later historical analyses, its spectacular fortunes in their translation into urban-built environments, now frames how tour guides, guidebook writers, and museum curators discuss the mansion. Contemporary interpretation acknowledges that the building represents not just architectural achievement, and it is that, a sophisticated example of classical revival design executed in expensive materials with considerable skill, but also the social and environmental costs of 19th century industrial capitalism. The beauty of the brownstone facade, the elegance of the classical proportions, the craftsmanship visible in every carved detail, all coexist with knowledge of what made construction possible. Silver, extracted by workers in extreme heat, forests cut to support underground tunnels, fortunes made through stock manipulation as well as through actual ore value, wealth that reflected and reinforced existing social hierarchies. This more complex understanding, this refusal to celebrate architecture without examining its contexts and costs, represents a shift in how Americans relate to historic buildings and to history generally. Earlier periods might have presented the Flood Mansion purely as a triumph, of wealth, of architecture, of survival through disaster. Contemporary interpretation, influenced by decades of social history scholarship and by growing awareness of environmental and labor issues, presents a more nuanced picture. The building is beautiful and problematic, as worthy of preservation while also worthy of critical examination, as evidence of both human capability and human cost. The Pacific Union Club, which has owned and occupied the building for more than a century, continues to maintain it carefully, funding conservation work when needed, repairing the bronze fence when sections corrode, updating interior systems while preserving historic fabric, and generally treating the structure as both functional space and historical trust. This ongoing maintenance represents a form of preservation distinct from museum curation. The building remains in active use, continuously adapting to changing needs and technologies while maintaining its essential character. New mechanical systems replace old ones as they fail. Plumbing and electrical infrastructure are updated to current codes. Accessibility improvements accommodate contemporary standards. Yet the brownstone walls, the window arrangements, the portico, the fence persist, maintained because they serve the club's interests while also serving preservation's interests. For visitors who walk Nob Hill, whether tourists following guidebook routes or residents enjoying the neighborhood's relative openness and dramatic views, the Flood Mansion functions primarily as a visual landmark and as a prompt for historical reflection. Tour guides stop groups on the sidewalk, point through the fence, and recount some version of the building's history. Comstock, silver, barren, most expensive house. On the hill, only mansion to survive the earthquake and fire, structurally. Now a private club. Tourists photograph the facade, capturing it from various angles, sometimes including themselves in the frame to document their presence at this historic site. The building appears in coffee table books about San Francisco architecture, in academic studies of Gilded Age wealth and Western urbanism, in preservation case studies examining adaptive reuse and private stewardship of historic properties, each publication approaching the building from different angles and extracting different meanings. The mansion's current meaning emerges from accumulation and layering. 138 years of history, visible to those who know how to read the signs. The brownstone itself, quarried in Connecticut and shipped around Cape Horn, remains stable, its slow weathering providing ongoing evidence of stone's durability, but not immunity to time. The bronze fence, cast in San Francisco workshops and installed at spectacular expense, continues to define the property's perimeter, its current patina, the product of decades of oxidation, of fog and rain and occasional maintenance. The spatial organization, though completely changed inside, still follows the envelope Laver established and Polk adapted. The building is simultaneously intact. The exterior survives remarkably unchanged and transformed, its interior spaces and social functions completely different from original intentions. In the introduction, we opened at dawn on April 18, 1906, the moment before the earthquake, with the mansion standing complete just before catastrophe. Now we close at another moment, more than a century later, the same facade under different light, the same fence under accumulated patina, the building that survived to witness everything that followed. The brownstone palace that James Clair Flood built to establish his family's permanence in San Francisco society has indeed achieved a form of permanence, though not the kind he likely imagined. It survives not as family estate passing through generations, but as institutional property, its preservation secured by utility to new owners rather than by family attachment. It survives not as symbol of one man's triumph, but as document of an era's values, ambitions, and costs. It survives not by resisting time, but by accumulating it, each decade adding new patinas and meanings without erasing earlier ones. The bronze fence still traces the boundary of one city block, still defines a line between public sidewalk and private interior, still marks the space that separates those who can enter from those who can only observe. Yet for visitors who stop to look through it, for scholars who study its history, for preservationists who work to protect it, the building is no longer simply a symbol of Gilded Age excess or a monument to private wealth. It has become something more complicated, an archive of San Francisco's evolution, a case study in preservation. Through adaptation, a prompt for thinking about what we value in old buildings and why, and a reminder that every monument, every palace, every attempt to achieve permanence through architecture inevitably becomes something its builder never intended. A historical artifact open to endless reinterpretation, its meanings multiplying as time passes and as new generations look at it with different eyes and ask different questions. The ultimate question is not whether the building will survive. Landmark protections, institutional investment, and ongoing utility make survival likely for the foreseeable future. But what stories we will tell about it, what aspects of its complex history we will emphasize, how we will balance admiration for architectural achievement with acknowledgement of social costs, how we will use this surviving fragment of 1886 to understand both past and present. The brownstone offers no answers, only evidence. The fence frames questions rather than solutions. The building stands as it has stood through earthquake and fire and 138 years of urban change, waiting for each new observer to decide what it means, what it represents, why it matters. That openness to interpretation, that capacity to mean different things to different people in different eras, may be the most durable thing architecture can achieve, not physical permanence, which is always partial and temporary, but semantic permanence, the ability to continue generating meaning and prompting reflection long after the original purposes have been exhausted and the original builders have been forgotten,